The shovel rose and fell, a silver arc in the flat morning light, slicing into the dense prairie sod that fought back with a tangle of roots thick as a man's thumb. Each cut was a negotiation, a grunt of effort against the land's stubborn inertia. Elias, barely 20, moved with a rhythm born of solitude, his body a simple machine of leverage and will. Beside the growing mound of dark earth, a rangy, brindle-coated dog named Boro lay with his head on his paws, amber eyes tracking the methodical work. The dog did not whine or pace. He watched, a silent, furry witness to the seemingly pointless task. Elias was digging a trench. Not for a foundation, not for irrigation, but a long, deep scar in his own property, 100 feet from the small, wind-battered clapboard house his parents had left him. It was now 40 feet long, 6 feet wide, and nearly 8 feet deep. He was going deeper. The goal, according to the worn leather journal that sat open on a nearby rock, was 12 feet.
"That's a fool's ditch, boy."
The voice came from the fence line. Elias didn't stop his rhythm. He drove the spade into the earth, leveraged the soil out, and tossed it onto the pile before turning. Mr. Gable stood there, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh winters and disappointing harvests. His hands, thick and calloused, rested on the top rail of the split-log fence. "Morning, Mr. Gable," Elias said. His voice was quiet, unused. "Morning. I suppose it is," Gable grumbled, gesturing with his chin at the trench. "You aim to bury a horse, or just yourself? Folks are talking. Say you've lost your senses since your folks passed." Elias wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty forearm. He looked at the trench, then back at his neighbor. "Building a home." Gable let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like rocks in a can. "A home? In a hole? That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. What happens when the first big rain comes? You'll have a mud pit. When the frost comes, the walls will heave and collapse on you. I've lived on this plain for 50 years, boy. The earth moves. It swallows things." "I have a plan," Elias said, his gaze dropping to the journal. The pages were filled with his grandfather's elegant, spidery script and precise, cross-hatched diagrams. Notes on thermal mass, the frost line, passive ventilation. Knowledge from a different time, a different place. An engineer who had seen things. "A plan in a book," Gable scoffed. "I've got plans that are written in my bones. Plans that say you build with wood, above the ground, where the good Lord can see you. You're digging your own grave." He shook his head, a final pronouncement of doom, and turned to walk back toward his own sensible, four-square farmhouse. Elias watched him go. He felt the sting of the words, the casual dismissal from the community that had watched him grow up. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. His parents had been taken by the flu 2 winters back, a winter so cold the firewood seemed to burn without giving heat. He remembered the wind finding every crack in the old house, the relentless, soul-stealing cold that made breath fog even by the stove. He would not endure another winter like that. The journal offered a different way. So he dug. Boro shifted, letting out a low whine, and nudged his cold nose into Elias's hand. Elias scratched the dog behind the ears, his calloused fingers catching in the thick fur. "He's wrong, Boro," he whispered. "It'll work." He picked up the shovel and went back to it. The sun climbed higher, beating down on his back. The world shrank to the scrape of steel on stone, the scent of damp earth, the ache in his shoulders, and the quiet trust of the dog at his side. This was his home. He just had to uncover it. Weeks bled into a month. The trench reached its prescribed depth of 12 feet. Now the real work began. Using a block and tackle rigged to an old oak, Elias began lowering salvaged foundation stones into the hole. Each one was a dead weight, a test of rope and muscle. He laid them with painstaking care, fitting them together, chinking the gaps with a mortar of clay and sand dug from the creek bed. It was slow, agonizing work. His hands, already tough, split and bled. He'd come inside at night, long after the sun had set, and tend to them by lamplight, Borrow licking the salt from his skin. Mrs. Albright, the pastor's wife, stopped by one afternoon, a basket covered with a checkered cloth in her hand. She watched him for a long time, her expression a mixture of pity and concern. "Elias, dear," she said finally, her voice soft. "Mr. Gable says you're living in a hole in the ground." "Not yet," Elias said, maneuvering a heavy stone into place. "Almost." "This isn't right. A young man like you. You'll catch your death of cold and damp down there. The church has a fund. We could help you fix up your parents' house. New windows, some insulation." "Thank you, ma'am," Elias said, not looking up. "But this is better." He gestured to the stone walls. "The earth keeps its own heat." She sighed, the sound of a good woman failing at her duty. "Well, I brought you some bread and a stew. Please eat it up here in the sunshine." She couldn't bring herself to imagine him eating in the gloom of the trench. She left the basket and walked away, her shoulders slumped. The next phase was the roof. He'd spent the last of his parents' money on 12 massive timber beams, thick as his own waist. Getting them across the span of the trench was the hardest thing he had ever done. He used rollers, levers, and every ounce of his strength, his body screaming in protest. Borrow would bark encouragement, a frantic, high-pitched sound that seemed to push back against the immense silence of the plains. One beam slipped, crashing down and missing him by inches. He sat for a full hour after that, his heart hammering against his ribs, the journal open on his lap, reassuring himself with the physics of his grandfather's drawings. It took him 2 weeks, but finally, the beams were in place, resting securely on the stone walls. He covered them with thick planking, then a layer of tar paper he'd scavenged. Then came the final, crucial step. He began to move the mountain of excavated earth, shovelful by shovelful, onto the roof. He piled it 3 feet deep, tamping it down, grading it gently to blend with the surrounding land. He worked until he was an automaton, a creature of dirt and sweat. Anna Gable brought him water sometimes. She was her father's daughter in her practicality, but her eyes held a curiosity that the others lacked. She didn't mock or pity. She watched. "My father says the weight will crush it," she said one hot afternoon, handing him a tin cup of cool well water. Elias drank it down in 3 long swallows, the cold a shock to his system. "It won't," he said, handing the cup back. "The load is distributed. It's an arch, even if it's flat." She looked at the structure, which was now beginning to disappear, becoming a low, unobtrusive mound in the landscape. "What about air? How will you breathe?" He pointed to 2 spots at opposite ends of the mound. "Vents, a low one for intake, a high one for exhaust. The warm air will rise and pull the cool air in." She nodded slowly, a small smile playing on her lips. "You've thought of everything." "My grandfather did," he corrected her gently. The skepticism of the town was a constant, low hum. At the general store, men would stop talking when he came in. He'd hear snippets of conversation as he left. "Dugout boy. Waiting for the cave-in." He ignored it. He bought what he needed. A small, efficient wood stove, lengths of stovepipe, glass for a single, deep-set window on the south-facing entrance, and carried on. By the first frost, the shelter was complete from the outside. A heavy, insulated door, angled down into the earth, was the only sign of its existence. He spent the next weeks finishing the interior, The floor was packed earth, smooth and hard as stone. He built a simple cot, a table, and shelves into the walls. The small stove sat in the center of the main room, its pipe running up through a carefully sealed collar in the roof. It was Spartan, but it was solid. It felt safe. The first snows came in late October, a light dusting that outlined the world in white. Elias moved the last of his supplies inside. Sacks of flour, beans, potatoes, crates of canned goods, and a carefully stacked cord of seasoned oak. He and Boro spent their first night in the shelter as the wind picked up outside. He lit a small fire in the stove. The space, which had been cool, slowly filled with a gentle, radiant warmth. There were no drafts. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind over the vent pipe, a distant, harmless whisper. Boro, who always shivered on the floor of the old house, was curled on a rag rug, fast asleep and twitching in a dream. Elias placed a thermometer on the wall. It read 68 degrees. He sat at his small table, running a hand over the smooth stone of the wall. It felt permanent. It felt like home. The winter settled in, deep and hard. The plains became a stark, empty canvas of white snow and blue-gray sky. Elias established a routine. He and Boro would emerge in the mornings into the biting cold, the air so frigid it felt sharp in his lungs. They'd walk the property, check for drifts, and then retreat back into the quiet warmth of the shelter. He read his grandfather's journal from cover to cover, then read it again. He repaired his tools. He waited. Mr. Gable saw him one morning as Elias was clearing snow from his entrance. Gable was bundled to his eyes in wool and fur, his breath pluming in the still 0-degree air. "Still alive in there, boy?" he called out, his voice muffled. "Still alive," Elias confirmed. "Just wait," Gable shouted, a prophecy against the cold. "Wait until the real winter hits. This is just a taste. That hole will be your tomb. The ground will freeze solid 6 feet down." Elias just nodded and went back to his work. Inside, the thermometer read 67 degrees. The earth was doing its job. The real winter arrived in the second week of January. It didn't come gradually. It fell upon the plains like a judgment. The sky turned a bruised, metallic gray, and the wind began to howl, a rising, malevolent shriek that carried the promise of violence. The radio called it a Siberian Express, a weather system of unprecedented scale and fury. They called it the Great White Hurricane. Elias was outside, securing the cover over his air intake pipe, when the first true blast hit. The force of it nearly knocked him from his feet. The temperature, already at 10 below zero, seemed to plummet instantly. The air was filled with a horizontal torrent of ice particles that stung his exposed skin like 1,000 needles. He wrestled the cover into place, his fingers numb and clumsy inside his mittens. Boro, whining with distress, huddled against his legs. They scrambled down the entryway and sealed the heavy door behind them, plunging themselves into sudden, profound silence. The fury of the storm was gone. Here, 12 feet under the surface of the earth, there was only the gentle hiss of the stove and the rhythmic thump of Boro's tail against the floorboards. The dog, relieved to be out of the maelstrom, licked Elias's frozen hand. Elias stoked the fire, adding a single piece of oak. He checked the thermometer. 67 degrees. Outside, the world was ending. The wind screamed at over 70 miles an hour. The snow didn't fall, it flew, a solid, blinding wall of white that erased the horizon, the sky, the very concept of distance. The temperature dropped to 20 below, then 30. With the wind, the feel on the skin was an unimaginable 80 degrees below zero. It was a cold that killed, a cold that broke things. Elias spent the first day in quiet routine. He cooked a meal. He read. He listened. He could feel the storm not as a sound, but as a subtle, deep vibration through the earth, a distant tremor of the chaos reigning on the surface. Boro slept, ate, and occasionally looked toward the door, his ears perked, as if he could hear the agony of the world outside. On the second day, the true nature of his sanctuary became clear. The air inside was fresh, drawn in through the long, underground intake pipe that warmed it with the earth's latent heat before it ever reached the living space. The smoke from the stove was pulled cleanly out the exhaust flue by the pressure differential the wind created. The design was working perfectly, just as the journal had described. He felt a deep, quiet surge of gratitude for the old man he'd never met. A man who had trusted the earth's simple, powerful logic. In the Gable farmhouse, it was a different story. The wind, a physical force, hammered at the walls. A fine, glittering dust of snow was being driven through the window frames, coating everything in a layer of frost. They had stuffed rags into every crack, but it was no use. The house groaned and shuddered with each gust. They had moved into the kitchen, the smallest, most defensible room, and huddled around the big cast-iron stove, which roared day and night, consuming wood at an alarming rate. Even 3 feet from the fire, the cold was a palpable presence, a predator in the room with them. On the morning of the third day, a sound like a cannon shot echoed through their house, followed by a deep, grinding crash. Mr. Gable fought his way to the back door and peered out into the white chaos. The roof of his massive barn, the proudest structure on his property, had collapsed under the impossible weight of the snow. A section of the main beam had snapped, and the entire northern slope had caved in, burying his livestock. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through him. His cows, his horses, his entire livelihood were trapped. He and Anna's husband, John, bundled themselves in every layer they owned and fought their way out into the storm. It was a fool's errand. They couldn't see 10 feet. The force of the wind drove the air from their lungs. After 15 minutes of brutal, fruitless effort, they stumbled back inside, their faces sheeted in ice, their hopes frozen. "We'll lose them all," Gable rasped, his voice raw. "We'll be ruined." They sat in the growing cold, the reality of their situation sinking in. The house was losing its battle. The temperature inside had dropped to 40 degrees, then 35. They were running out of firewood for the main stove. Then, another sound. A high-pitched, splintering crack from the attic. The house itself was beginning to fail. It was Anna who said it first. Her voice was small, almost a whisper, against the roar of the wind. "Elias." Gable looked at her, his face grim. "The boy in the hole?" "His shelter," she said, her eyes wide with a desperate hope. "He said it would be warm. He said the earth would protect him." "It's a grave," Gable said, the words hollow, his old certainty gone. "It's a chance," she insisted. "It's the only one we have." The decision was made in silence. They bundled their 2 small children, packed a small bag with what little they could carry, and prepared to face the storm. The 100-yard journey to Elias's property was a life-or-death struggle. They formed a human chain, Gable in the lead, feeling his way along the fence line he knew by heart. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them apart. The cold was a physical pain, a crushing weight on their chests. It felt like an hour, a lifetime, before Gable's foot stumbled against the low, snow-covered mound. They clawed at the snow, searching for the door, their gloved hands clumsy and useless. Finally, Gable's hand found the handle. He banged on the thick wood with all his remaining strength, his fist making a dull, muffled thud. He shouted Elias's name, but the wind snatched the words from his mouth and hurled them away. He banged again, a frantic, desperate rhythm. For a terrible moment, there was nothing. Then, he heard the sound of a bolt being drawn, and the door swung inward. A wave of warm, still air washed over them. It was like stepping into another world. Elias stood there, silhouetted by the soft glow of a lantern. He held it up, his expression calm, his eyes taking in their desperate, ice-caked forms. Boro stood at his side, tail giving a single, tentative wag. "Come in," Elias said, his voice impossibly quiet. "Hurry." They stumbled down the short flight of steps, out of the screaming wind and into the sanctuary. The door closed, and the world went silent. The contrast was so profound, it was dizzying. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. The children, who had been crying, fell silent, their eyes wide with wonder. Gable stood in the center of the room, slowly turning. He peeled off his icy gloves, his bare hands tingling in the warmth. He looked at the smooth stone walls, the sturdy ceiling beams, the small, efficient stove that glowed with a gentle heat. He looked at the thermometer on the wall. It read 67 degrees.
It's warm, he whispered, the words catching in his throat.
He looked at Elias, at this boy he had mocked and dismissed. He saw no triumph in Elias's eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw only a quiet, steady competence. "There's coffee on the stove," Elias said, "and stew. Sit down." Over the next few hours, others arrived. The Albrights, their own roof having partially collapsed. The Jensens, their fuel oil frozen solid in the tank. Each time a desperate pounding came at the door, Elias would open it and welcome them in. His small shelter filled with the huddled forms of his neighbors. 23 people and 2 dogs packed into the space he had carved out of the earth. He shared his food, his water, his blankets. He moved with a calm economy, tending to a child's frost-bitten fingers, reassuring a frightened mother, saying little, doing everything. He was no longer the town eccentric. He was their anchor in the storm. The community he had been ostracized from was now reborn, 12 feet beneath the frozen ground, in the home he had built with his own 2 hands. The blizzard raged for another full day before it finally broke. When Elias opened the door on the 5th morning, it was to a world transformed. A profound, unearthly silence lay over a landscape buried in monumental drifts of snow, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The air was still and lethally cold. One by one, the families emerged from the shelter, blinking in the bright light like creatures from a hibernation. They looked upon the devastation of their properties. Roofs were caved in, windows shattered, outbuildings obliterated. But they were alive, every single one of them. They gathered in a loose group on the snow, their breath misting in the frigid air. They looked at the unassuming grass-topped mound that had saved them. Then they looked at Elias. Mr. Gable stepped forward. He was a proud man, not given to apologies. He stood before Elias for a long moment, his face working. Finally, he just reached out and put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You were right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool. You saved us, boy. You saved all of us." He paused, then added, "Thank you." A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd. Mrs. Albright, her eyes wet with tears, hugged him. Others clapped him on the back. In that moment, standing in the wreckage of the great storm, Elias was no longer an outsider. The foundation of the community had been broken, but here, in this frozen field, it was being rebuilt, stronger and deeper than before. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of Elias's shelter became legend. The town rebuilt, but differently. Men who had once mocked him now came to him, hats in hand, asking to see his grandfather's journal. Elias, quiet as ever, shared it freely. He helped Mr. Gable design a root cellar that doubled as a storm shelter. He showed the Jensens how to build a small, earth-bermed wall on the north side of their new house to blunt the force of the winter wind. The knowledge spread. Small, practical changes began to appear all over the county. People started digging down, not just building up. They were learning to listen to the earth. Elias and Anna were married the following spring, in a simple ceremony by the creek. Their life was quiet and deeply rooted. They expanded the shelter, adding another room, and eventually raised 2 children in its warm, secure embrace. The old clapboard house was torn down, its wood repurposed. The shelter was their only home. Years passed. The seasons turned. The Great White Hurricane became a story told to grandchildren, a benchmark against which all other storms were measured. Elias's shelter became a permanent feature of the landscape, a gentle green hill that was known to all as a place of refuge. Whenever the forecast turned grim, the door was always unlocked. Boro grew old. His brindle muzzle turned gray, his movements stiffened. He spent most of his days sleeping on the rug by the stove, the same spot where he had slept as a young dog on that first night. One autumn evening, when the air had the first sharp bite of coming cold, he laid his head in Elias's lap, gave a soft sigh, and was still. Elias and Anna buried him on the slope of the shelter, near the entrance, under a small, flat stone. He had been the first believer. More years flowed by, as relentless as the prairie wind. Elias grew into an old man, his back stooped from a lifetime of work, his hands gnarled, but his eyes still held the same quiet certainty. Anna passed first, and Elias lived on for another 5 years, tended to by his children and grandchildren. He was a quiet patriarch, a man of few words but immense presence. He never boasted. He never had to. The proof of his wisdom was all around him, in the safer homes, in the cellars full of food, in the community that had learned to endure. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the cot he had built more than 60 years before, in the quiet, warm dark of the earth. They buried him next to Anna, on a hill overlooking the town. The entire community came to pay their respects. They erected a simple granite headstone. It didn't list dates or accomplishments in the usual way. It had his name, and beneath it, an epitaph that Mr. Gable's grandson, now the town mayor, had suggested. It read, "Elias Thorne. He dug deep and built a home for all." Decades later, the town was still there, a testament to resilience. The original shelter had been preserved, a small, grassy monument maintained by the Historical Society. On a crisp autumn afternoon, a young couple, new to the area, walked by it with their small daughter. "What's that, Daddy?" the girl asked, pointing to the low green hill with its sturdy, weathered door. The man smiled and crouched down, pulling her close. "That," he said, his voice filled with a reverence he'd learned from his own father, "is the place that taught us how to live here. That's the home of the man who listened to the ground." The girl looked at the quiet mound, then at the vast, open sky, and for the first time she began to understand the shape of wisdom. The shelter stood, silent and steadfast, its roof of living grass greening with the promise of spring, a permanent feature of the land it had been born from, its warmth held deep within.